it's absurd, and I haven't had that opportunity to just be able to tell my story. It's a story that it's struggled with over the last 4 years, that I'm a gay Latino man. And it doesn't bother me. It's more of my concern for my kids.
A bombshell dropped on Jason Rantz's show on AM 770 KTTH this week. Former Seattle Police Chief Adrian Diaz comes out as gay as he tries to put allegations of sexual harassment behind him. Plenty to unpack there, plus an update on the Belltown Hellcat, the muscle car and the driver now ordered to pay an $83,000 fine. And that's just one of the legal issues we're now understanding about this driver. And what about a new power struggle brewing over police recruitment and how recruits are tested by the city of Seattle? Yes, we have plenty to cover this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm here once again with my co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I got to ask, we've been tracking this app-based delivery driver wages issue here in Seattle and just waiting for this vote on it. But it appears council members keep excusing themselves from meetings. So are you keeping a closer eye on meeting agendas or vacation schedules for the council members these days?
I know, yeah. It's hard to keep track of. Who knows if or when this vote will ever actually happen.
I'm interested to see that too, but be forewarned, listeners, we will be talking about it here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews when it does. Thank you, David. As always, thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast and on the first floor of City Hall. And a special thanks to the patrons who keep the show going, like Rob. Intern Rob, you are the man. He sent in a question we're still working on answering. Appreciate the feedback and definitely appreciate the support, Rob. Our patrons get their questions answered here on the show. They get their own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. How cool is that? Also access to patrons first content before anyone else too. So please find the podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. A huge thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's light this candle. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, this week, a turn I certainly didn't see coming in the story of Adrian Diaz, former chief of the Seattle Police Department, coming out as gay on conservative talk radio AM 770 KTTH and denying allegations of misconduct towards any female officers, as he's been accused of. David, I really think these are two separate stories. One, that Diaz wants to come out, live his truth, as he puts it, and reckon with the fact that he's married to a woman whom he's had 3 kids with. He's also up for a job in Austin, Texas, apparently. He wants to clear the slate here. The part that I feel is separate and needs to be separate is dealing with these allegations that somehow his sexuality is part of the defense, at least how I'm reading what he's saying, as to why these allegations are not true. Now, Diaz did say in that interview, being gay doesn't mean you can't be a misogynist, but this is the point where the story gets a little murky for me. How are you unpacking this, David?
Yeah, far be it for me to say when or how somebody should come out. I'm sure it's a difficult thing for him and his family, especially as what you said, he has 3 kids and he's married. And, I'm sure that's a challenging thing for all of them. It, also comes at a time when he personally has been under fire for how the Seattle Police Department has managed its employees, specifically its women. Those are both fairly big news items that happen to be happening at the same time. How hard you want to try and disentangle the two, I think, depends on kind of how much credit you're willing to give Diaz. I mean, he says that these allegations about how he handled the police department are false, and he's pretty flatly rejected them. So, if you take that, then it's been a busy time for him, and so this is his opportunity. He's saying is to kind of come out and he finally can come up for air and say that. I think the more cynical view that some people are taking is, the implication that he couldn't be sexist or misogynist because of his kind of sexual orientation. I don't know Diaz. I don't know the circumstances well enough to say exactly his motivations here, but it's a messy situation. Like I said, again, I'm not in a position to question how or when somebody decides to come out, but the fact of him being in the news as much as he has been already for less than ideal things, it just kind of makes the whole situation a little little complicated, we'll say.
For sure. And I guess, was this the right move to, quote, get ahead of the story, I guess you'd say, or did Diaz dig himself a deeper hole here? I think about the fact that he's up for a job in Austin, Texas, and I'm really wondering, what are the people in Texas thinking about all this? This is a lot to process for a chief candidate.
I think now that he's no longer chief, in some ways it was probably not going to be a story if he didn't want it to be. But he chose to, go on a fairly widely listened to and partisan, talk show and make this a news story, which again is his right. If he wants to do that, that's totally his right to do. I don't know that it would have been a news story otherwise. I mean, it may be a small one, but the fact of it, him coming out and very sort of publicly pronouncing this, that in and of itself makes it a news story.
I'm just really complicated on this one, as I'm hearing you say it too, and I wonder, is a city like Austin, Texas, scared away from this approach that Diaz is taking here, or?
Yeah, I would think the bigger barrier for Texas would be all of how the Seattle Police Department was run.
Right.
I mean, if they're interested in hiring Adrian Diaz, I would imagine that they'd need to and want to do a lot of due diligence behind the allegations. And that's, if I'm a city leader or a mayor, if Mayor Bruce Harrell was hiring somebody who had recently been fired on allegations of quote grooming, Harrell would have to make a very, very good case to the public for why those allegations don't bother him. So I would think the same calculation is playing out in Austin, Texas. I don't know if or how his going on Jason Rants and coming out as gay changes that. I would think not much. I would think really that, like I said, the hurdle is the other stuff, the reasons why he was finally fired by Harrell.
Right, and some cases that at least legally are not settled yet in terms of those allegations there. So very interested to see where this story goes and what the city of Austin, Texas does here. But meanwhile, former Chief Adrian Diaz is on special assignment, and we'll see what happens there. I wanted to follow up on the Belltown Hellcat. You've been writing about this a little bit, David. This is the muscle car, folks, that's been making noise in more ways than one in Seattle. The infamous driver, Miles Hudson, actually did show up in Seattle Municipal Court this week. I really thought he wouldn't, but he did show up. He's facing a fine of more than $83,000. He told the judge he's bringing his car into compliance, but the judge in this case says he'll still need to pay that fine. Also, as reported in the New York Times, there's a court in Renton that's following up on some domestic charges against Mr. Hudson involving his mother, including one assault. Hudson pleaded guilty to that assault charge a few years ago, had much of his jail sentence suspended if he met conditions like no criminal violations. The Times reporting the court is revisiting the case. And David, you've written about what the city of Seattle is working on to stop more of these cases this summer. I want to get to that in a second. But are we seeing the end of the saga of the Belltown Hellcat playing out before us? What do you think here?
It's an interesting situation because his identity, and it sounds like his financial picture is based on him getting as much attention as possible. And he's using that to great effect on social media. And so it's kind of how much is the attention that he's getting sort of, in fact, emboldening him? I would say up until this point, quite a bit. And he seems to be implying that he's making a lot of money on Instagram. I don't doubt that that's true. And it seems like he's making enough money that he's not that worried about the tens of thousands of dollars the city of Seattle is coming after him for. Eventually, though, I think the leash will run out, and it might be starting to get there at this point. I don't know what's next. Maybe impounding of the car, possibly jail time if he keeps sort of spurning the city. Yeah, I think in some ways, if he wouldn't be here to the point he is today had everyone just ignored him.
Sure.
But also, he might be flying a little too close to the sun at this point.
Yeah. I love the Icarus reference, one of my favorite ones. I will say I've gotten a few comments from patrons on this one, including one patron who identifies themselves as Groucho the Grouch, and talking about Bob Kettle, who's really trying to crack down on this too. He sounds like Mr. Tough Guy mustering the full force of city power to catch this, checks notes, kid driving his car. But I really do think that the city wants to put some more emphasis on this, David, because you wrote about this. Kettle has sponsored this measure. He alluded to this on Council Edition on Seattle Channel with me a couple of weeks ago. But the city now wants to issue a $500 ticket to the owner of any car being used in illegal street racing, even if someone else is behind the wheel. Talk to us a little bit about this new measure and what impact the city is hoping it might have.
It's interesting. The motivation does not come from the Belltown Hellcat exactly. The city has been seeing a lot more, has been seeing these fairly large street racing events, which are loud and dangerous because they're illegal, and it's people sort of reenacting Fast and Furious or whatever,
Sure.
so driving recklessly and causing damage and certainly disruptive to the people who live in the area. And so the city has really been wanting to kind of crack down on those. But if you only have a patrol officer or two going out to these events that have hundreds of people and 70, 80 cars or something,
sure,
there's not a lot that officer can do, because they have to hold people liable, have to like find who the driver is and actually arrest that person. So that the idea of this legislation is you create this new tier of very expensive citation, which is kind of in the same category as like a parking ticket or something, but it means an officer can go through and without getting out of their car can write down license plate numbers and identifying information and then send the owners of those cars citation. So it's not a criminal penalty for the people driving it, but if you own one of these cars and you're letting your friends drive them, you might think twice about that, because you could end up with several $500 fines, and that can add up pretty quickly. It intersects with the Hellcat driver, Miles Hudson, because he's been sort of flaunting his loophole approach to his battle with the city. Is he was told he couldn't drive his car, so he's posted these videos of him sitting in the passenger seat while somebody else drives the car. Mm-hmm. This measure would still, as at least a partial owner of this car, this measure would still make him liable for $500 citations if that's the case. And so, I think it's mostly aimed at street racing with the added bonus of being an extra tool that the city can use against Mr. Hudson.
Right. And when you think about the way the city is leaning towards having more cameras up, to having all of its police cars have license plate reading technology, I really think there's an effort here to use the full power of that technology to try to stop something like this.
Yeah, I think there's a broader trend toward automated enforcement that, especially around traffic-related enforcement, because sort of combination of staff shortages in police departments, pretty horrendous traffic death and fatality numbers. I think so. Cities have become more interested in technology that can at least do some of that work that officers used to do. And so, all the technologies that you mentioned, I think, kind of fall into that category.
And let's talk about what's up next. Putting the King County Crisis Care Levy into action. We're discussing how the county council voted on this issue this week and what it could mean for our region. That's next on Now Hear This. Well, we are getting closer to what will be the biggest expansion of mental health care in King County in decades, as the King County Council voted unanimously this week to move ahead with a plan to build 5 emergency behavioral health care centers. Voters approved a levy to pay for these centers last year, and County Council member Gurmai Zahalai says it's time for King County to step up and finish the job.
When you think about these issues, when you walk across somebody who's doing drugs, when you walk across somebody who's face down in the pavement, when you walk across somebody who's in clear mental health crisis, a lot of people wonder, what is the next step to provide the care for this person that's needed? And what I found out is that emergency rooms are over capacity, hospitals are over capacity, the jails are over capacity, permanent supportive housing, there isn't enough of it.
Zahalai speaking to Chris Daniels on Como 4 News there. David, the council voted to set the rules essentially as to who can run a crisis care center and how those providers would be evaluated. I've read a lot of Taylor Blatchford's work in the Seattle Times about this. Great piece. The understanding is the first facility would be up and running by 2026 and would likely be in downtown Seattle. The 4 other facilities we'll have to see. And I was just thinking about this because the vote by the King County Council is one thing. Getting the public buy-in as to where a facility like this is located is another. It feels like that may be the biggest battle ahead here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that was always going to be the big battle. We saw this with the safe consumption sites that never went anywhere, which is people are resistant to accepting social services in their neighborhood. That's why I think downtown is going to be a fairly easy place, in the grand scheme to locate it. Mm-hmm. But, I think of when there was going to be a homeless shelter opening in the Chinatown International District. There were neighborhood-wide protests that, including that Councilmember Wu participated in, derailing those plans and shutting it down. And so, and this is countywide, I think, for as much as elected officials or folks in suburban cities maybe talk poorly about Seattle, their willingness, I think, to accept some of the sort of weight or burden of handling this mental health crisis, I think, is going to be perhaps hesitant, because we often hear arguments about, we don't want to become Seattle, we don't want to. I think it's going to be a really messy fight.
I will say, I thought Taylor made a great point in terms of the cities that were interested, the research that was done here. Sounds like Bothell, Lake Forest Park, Burien, Kirkland, Kent, Renton, Auburn, Kenmore, Redmond, Bellevue have put in some interest about this. It's just moving from interest to actually building a facility is the next part here. And I did want to move on to this larger question for me, David, because the county is saying these facilities could care for nearly 70,000 people per year when the system is fully expanded, and really help finish off this trifecta of, you need someone to call, like 988, for example. You need somebody to respond, like the mobile crisis teams the levy also pays for. And then you need a place to go, these centers. How do you see this larger system playing out here, David? Has the county really found an answer for this sprawling problem of mental health crises?
I would stop short of calling it an answer. I have heard some concern, too, about whether they will really serve the kind of hardest to serve. It's a step, though. I don't know that we should think of any of these approaches as something that's going to really provide an answer.
Yeah.
It will create something that might be useful that does not exist right now.
There was so much discussion in the council meeting about how do we actually transport people to these facilities, and when they're out of those facilities, which can include that kind of 23-hour type setup or even a 14-day stay, from what I'm reading here. How do we transport people away from them, and what's that handoff look like? So I hear what you're saying, and I feel like the county is paying close attention to this too. This has to be one piece in the puzzle. The county can't solve all this by themselves.
It's tricky, because a lot of people are in really tough spots, and there's concurrent drug addiction that goes with it, and of course homelessness. And it's one thing to provide emergency services, and that's a good thing for people who need those services in that moment. It's the other thing to make sure people do not have to continue to return to those emergency services. And that is really the challenging part through all this.
Right. It's really just one piece of that structure there. Where do they go after they go to the emergency facility? That's definitely a big question. Thank you for that, David. And I wanted to stay on the topic of mental health with you, if I could, and bring up what Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell unveiled on Friday of last week, a $10 million investment, as he put it, in youth mental health. It's a response in part to the recent fatal shooting at Garfield High School, and the money would be allocated at the start of the 2024 school year. So within a couple of months, for mental health services using telehealth to help students and violence prevention too. Now, the mayor says his team has actually been researching where to put some of these dollars over the past 6 months, so long before the Garfield shooting. And there may be some more investments next year in this regard. David, I was looking at this. The mayor's report points out when it comes to youth mental health, there's state money through the schools. There's levy dollars that we vote on. There's city money. There's county money. There's philanthropy. There's insurance, and so much more involved here. And that really raises a question for me at the end of the day: who's in charge of youth mental health? I know that's a huge question, but I really wanted to throw it out there at you.
Yeah, it is a good question. The state generally isn't tasked with mental health systems, but for adults,
right?
Of course, they have the hospitals. The county has some stake in kind of treatment options, and we just talked about the crisis care centers.
Right.
Seattle Public Schools, of course, their duty is to their students. And how far that extends into mental health, I don't know. This is Seattle's involvement here is kind of interesting, and it had come up in council when in the context of the Jumpstart tax, because I believe that's where this money is coming from, which is this council was sort of skeptical of the previous council's decision to invest or to promise $20 million for youth mental health. I think in the category of a trend we've seen with this council, which is basically, why is Seattle getting involved in things that are not technically within Seattle's purview, and some skepticism towards that. The biggest example for me was, with the Tukwila asylum seeker problem that we wrote about. But I think this kind of falls into that category too. And so, the council had been talking about basically, can we take back the money that had been promised for mental health? I think that their conversation around that gets more complicated now that Mayor Harrell has actually laid out how at least part of it wants to be. he wants to spend it because the council's complaint was the money there, but it hasn't been allocated. Well, now about half of it has been at least promised to specific programs. And so I don't know if the timing that there, I hadn't asked, I don't know if the timing from Harold's office was related at all to the council's comments. I think it was probably a coincidence. But yeah, I mean, it does kind of commit Seattle to being involved in an area that this council had at least expressed some hesitance to become involved in.
And I mean, just the way the city is involved with the schools when it comes to the preschool and the promise levy there. I mean, there's a lot of different connections between the city and our schools that make up a part of what the city's doing. But I wanted to lay one more factoid on you about from the mayor's report. It really jumped out at me, David. So during the 22-23 school year, there were 2,895 7th, 8th, and 9th grade Seattle Public School students who were screened. They were given mental health screening. Of those students, 10% were identified for suicidal ideation, self-harm, safety risk, or wanting to talk to a counselor immediately. So we're talking about close to 300 kids here. They received help within 2 days. But the report continues. This shows the potential benefit of mental health screening. However, there is currently no universal screening available for all Seattle student teens. And this, David, is where I think, and maybe this goes back to the crisis care discussion too, I hear $10 million from the city. That starts to sound like a really small number because expanding these kind of services, it's just a massive process.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think you can make the argument that $10 million is better than $0. And I don't think anyone expects Seattle's investment to be the investment into this. Because, after the Garfield shooting, there had been a lot of talk around law enforcement specifically and what law enforcement should be doing, increase law enforcement presence around Garfield. Should there be a cop in the school? I think what this does, and, not to break it too into kind of crass political terms, but I think what this does is for the mayor's office signal, yes, we're talking about police and police presence around schools, but hey, we're also putting some money where our mouth is when it comes to actually, things, non-law enforcement approaches to kind of helping kids out. It sounds like they've been talking about it for a while, so maybe this was going to come out regardless of what happened at Garfield, but it does kind of put a flag in the ground for this mayor's office that they are interested in doing more than just talking about police when it comes to keeping kids safe.
Important part of this formula for sure. Thank you for that, David. And I want to talk about what's coming up next year. The City Council's proposal to use a new testing service to make it easier for recruits to become Seattle police officers. It's not exactly going to plan. David's been working on this story. We're going to break it down on what's next. Heads up, I'm still doing some research on a great question from Rob, one of our patrons. We're going to be getting to it soon. Rob, sorry for the delay. I want to make sure I get you a comprehensive answer on this. That is coming up very soon. Patrons, hit us up at Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Spell it out at gmail.com with questions. We will work on answering them. But David, back to you here. You wrote recently about the City Council's recent police hiring measure, which suggested that the city could adopt and should adopt a new test that the data shows has a better pass rate, which could potentially increase the amount of recruits coming in for these cop jobs. Seattle, like many other cities, has had trouble hiring police. The number of sworn officers is around 900 right now, down from 1,400 pre-pandemic. But there's been some pushback on this from Seattle's Independent Civil Service Commission, which actually administers these tests. Can you break down what's going on here?
Yeah, it's kind of it's very interesting back and forth that I'd be surprised if anyone in the general public can actually follow the kind of wonkiness of all this, because it is pretty technical. We're not talking about, sexy fights here, but
it is a power struggle for sure.
It is absolutely a power struggle. As a recruit to any police department, you have to take some kind of entry level test. It's the first step to get in. Those are generally provided by private contractors, private companies that work with departments to write these tests. Seattle has used one for the last 10 years that is used by kind of big departments up and down the West Coast, but most other departments in the state use a separate test. And so the thought is, hey, we want to be competing more directly with all these other Washington departments because we think we're losing recruits to Bellevue or Shoreline or Kent or wherever it might be. So we want to make it easier for those people to include Seattle in their application to Washington departments. Initially, the mayor's office and the city council wanted to kind of mandate this shift, but it's administered by this independent civil service commission that has the legal authority to decide how the hiring process goes. And the executive director of that commission had raised some concerns about switching tests, partially because the tests that they were looking at switching to had a much higher pass rate. So there were questions around standards. She hadn't come to any conclusion about it, but wanted to do research. And so her conclusion, which came out on Monday, was, look, I know you're talking about maybe we can use both of these tests, but she said that raises a lot of really complicated questions, because then you create kind of potential for dispute, which is, if I apply and take one test and I don't get accepted, I can maybe make the argument that, hey, this other person took an easier test and therefore got an unfair advantage over me. And that raises some logistical and possibly legal concerns there.
Right.
But then also she was saying, the proctors of this other test have told us basically that they would need to tailor it pretty specifically to Seattle anyway, which then kind of defeats the purpose of the initial argument, because people are going to have to take a separate test if they want to apply to Seattle anyway.
Wow.
It sounds like there was a bit of drama with this new testing company. They kind of backed out of answering questions, it sounds like. And at the end of the day, this commission said, hey, look, we think switching to a new test doesn't make a lot of sense. There are logistical and legal concerns. We think the test that we have now is working pretty well. Therefore, we're not going to pursue switching tests here. I haven't heard from the council yet, but I did hear from the mayor's office, and they are kind of apoplectic about this conclusion. They think it's poorly rendered, and I assume that Council President Sarah Nelson feels similarly.
Right, because she was the one who was really pushing for this at the council level and sponsored the legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we have already seen a bit of tension between this council and city staff, because, a lot of this council was elected on, hey, we're going to do things differently. And whereas a lot of the staff, of course, carries over from before. And so there has been already a bit of tension between nonpartisan, non-elected staff in City Hall. And this, I would say, is the top example, which is the elected offices of the mayor's office and the council warring with the executive director of an independent commission over what is arguably their kind of top issue, which is to recruit and hire new police officers.
Wow, this is going to be an interesting one to unravel. But David, thank you for the reporting on that in the Seattle Times. But it is time to wrap up with you, my friend. And I saw you posted about this, an optimistic tweet you wrote last year after the Mariners missed the playoffs, and looking back, you deleted it. Here we are this season with the M's up by 10 games in their division. It sounds like you're upset that your future forecasting has been turned into cyber dust here. What's going on?
Yeah, I know. I tend to send more tweets than I should around baseball, and then I go back and delete them all. Not because they're inappropriate, but just because some timeline hygiene. Sure. Them up a little bit. So that was one of them I deleted. I predicted. I think I said the Mariners are going to win 96 games next year and make it to the World Series, which at the time felt, in retrospect, I was like, oh, that's kind of way too optimistic, but as of yesterday, they're on pace, I think, for like 95 wins. So now I wish I hadn't deleted it, because if it turned out to be right, I would have looked like a fortune teller. But oh well.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I looked back at our shows from about that time in the fall of last year. I'm so sorry, man. I don't think I saved it either, but I still think you're a genius. How about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, as always, David, for joining me here. Thanks to everybody listening to this episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks especially to the patrons who support this show. If you would like to be a patron, find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. And if you listen, once again, please consider supporting the show as a patron. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.